I've recently fallen completely in love with the Dragon Quest IV soundtrack, and going through the music, I've found a technique that comes up a lot and ends up heavily contributing to the Dragon Quest sound. The technique in question is the chromatically falling bass line. This is where, instead of following the root notes of each chord like basses usually do, the bass line moves down in half steps, whether these half steps take them outside of the key or not. This leaves the chromatic or out-of-key notes in these bass lines to be justified by the harmony. The chords always have to find a way to make the bass notes make sense. You can see a simple example right from the very beginning of the series' iconic main theme. Most of the theme is structured in a very straightforward way, with a grand, stately melody sticking close to the chord progression, which changes one chord every bar. This is not the case for the first bar, though, which sees the bass and melody starting on the same note, C, and then both moving in quarter notes in opposite directions. In Dragon Quest IV's iteration of this theme, the bass movement is somewhat obscured by these triplet embellishments, but if we simplify the bass line to the form that it usually takes throughout the series, it looks like this. Combined with the middle voice, we can see the chords moving on each beat from C to G over B to C over B flat to F over A, and this is what I want to zero in on. The introduction of a B flat note so early in this C major piece. This kind of regal, classical sound could have easily been achieved with the bass going down the major scale, C, B, A, G, and that would have sounded totally fine. Opting instead for this chromatic motion from B to B flat to A exposes composer Koichi Sugiyama's deep understanding of harmony and voice leading. You can read this chromatic move as being a C7 with the 7th of the chord in the bass, moving to an F chord with the chord's 3rd A in the bass. As I went into in-depth in my video on secondary dominant chords, any given chord in a progression can be preceded by a dominant chord a 5th above. So while B flat isn't in the key of C, bringing one in as part of a C7 to F move is a totally functional way to emphasize that F chord. What Mr. Sugiyama understood, rest in peace, is that all chord movements work the way they do thanks to a confluence of individual voices moving together in harmony. The C7 to F secondary dominant works because of the combination of two movements. The B flat note, the 7th of our C7 chord, moving down a half step to an A, the 3rd of the arrival point of F major. And the E note, the 3rd of our C7 chord, resolving up to an F. Without counting the triplet embellishments in the bass, the C7 chord in this overture actually doesn't even have a C note in it, but it still acts like and sounds like a C7 to F because both of the key voice leading movements are happening in the melody and bass line here. The inner voice is just jumping around to grab whatever other chord tones it can to fill out each chord. As part of a larger chromatic line in the bass, moving from C to B onto this implied secondary dominant maneuver, the effect is so smooth that you barely register that we're stepping out of the key. But compared to a straight major scale version, you can hear how much color and character this chromatic bass note adds to the music. Now, this is admittedly a very small chunk of music to zero in on so hard, even by my standards. But now that you've seen the chromatic bass line in action, you'll notice it popping up all over the Dragon Quest IV soundtrack. By applying this bassline principle, the simplest harmonic moves become sophisticated. In Royal Minuet, a simple 1 to 4 to 5 progression in the key of E minor is dressed up with a descending bass line to better fit the dignified surroundings. Starting from E, the first two bars see the bass moving down to D and then C sharp, landing on a C natural underneath the 4 chord, giving us a first inversion A minor 6, and then settling down on a B note for the 5 chord at the end of the phrase. What makes this even cooler, though, is that the 3/4 waltz time is cleverly hidden by the bass and melody, moving in half notes for the first 2 bars, crossing the bar line and only giving in to the classic waltz feel on bar 3. The chromatic shift from a C-sharp bass note, which makes a C-sharp half-diminished chord in combination with the held E minor chord above it, to a C note under this A minor 6 chord has such a bleak feeling to it that you wouldn't be able to access with just your standard 1 to 4 chord progression. But the bleakness doesn't last long as we suddenly shift to an E major chord, which begins a much longer chromatic descent in the bass, which manages to take us through a few different keys before it's done. To facilitate the chromatic bass line, we see a dominant chord with its 7th in the bass resolved to a tonic chord with the 3rd in the bass, just like we saw in the series' main theme. Only this time, we get a chain of these secondary dominant resolutions that takes us all over the map. From our surprise E major chord, we shift down to a B over D sharp, moving to an E over D, resolving to an A over C sharp, then moving to a D over C, which resolves to a G over B. This moves to an A sharp diminished 7 chord before stepping back up to a B chord to set up a return to the top of the form. A lot of the time, when you have a chain of secondary dominants like this, it can feel a bit like falling down the stairs, each chord plunking us abruptly into a new key. But here, the smoothness of the bass motion obscures where one key ends and the next key starts. We're effortlessly sliding through each shift, turning this phrase into a thrilling excursion out of bounds with a slick return back home. The same effortless weaving between keys makes the game's town theme incredibly charming, thanks in no small part to yet another chromatic descending bass part. Secondary dominant moves emphasize each of the main harmonic centers, starting on C, moving to A minor, going back to C, landing on an F, and then a nice classical cadence ending the phrase back on our home chord of C. But each of these main tonal territories are detailed with elaborate chord movements on just about every beat, driven, once again, by the descending bass. The first 2 bars start with a C chord, and then the bass descends chromatically all the way down to an F sharp. Notice the same implied secondary dominant to the F chord that we had in the game's main theme. We have the same smooth bass slide down that we've heard in the game's Overture, but this time the bass keeps going down in half steps, moving to an A flat major 7 chord with no 5th, stepping down to a nice calm C over G, and then settling on a dissonant F sharp half diminished chord. These are some crunchy chords to include in a delightful little town theme, but including them as part of a larger descending bass line helps to smooth them out. Also, notice how the melody sticks to a repeated G note for most of the phrase, providing a steady counterpoint to the moving bass. The melody is very simple and sweet, and the bass line is smooth and stable, so these more colorful chords can slot right in without damaging the pleasant aesthetic that the piece is going for. This last F-sharp half-diminished chord ends the stepwise movement of the bass and kicks off some motion around the circle of 4ths, moving into A minor territory with the following B7 sus to E7 flat 9, resolving to A minor. Breaking up the descending bass with bigger bass leaps is a great way to introduce some contrast. But once we land on this A minor, the bass starts its descent again. We move down from A minor to G to F sharp to end this phrase once again on an F sharp half diminished chord, but instead of kicking off more conventional 4th motion this time, the bass continues moving down in half steps through the next bar, going from F sharp half diminished to a G over F that resolves to a C over E. Then continues on to an E flat diminished 7 chord that resolves down to a D minor 7 chord, which breaks up the bass with more 4th motion moving to the following G7. The return of that G over F to C over E. This move just never gets old. It's a great way to facilitate a chromatic bass line, but so is using diminished chords like this E flat diminished 7. Diminished chords are great because you can basically fill in the chromatic note between any 2 bass notes with a diminished chord and get away with it. They resolve so neatly to wherever you're going. The last phrase sees this D minor 7 to G7 resolve back to our tonic C and then ends with a flourish as another bass walk down secondary dominant lands us on the 4 chord, this F over A. The bass hops around the circle of fifths from here to get to a G and then a very classical C over G to G7 to C sus to C, finishes out the section. It's interesting how the pattern of the bass line doesn't line up with the structure of the phrases. The melody is structured very classically, taking one solid 8-bar statement and breaking it up evenly into 2-bar phrases. But the bass line follows a pattern of 2 bars of descending motion broken up by 1 bar of fourth motion, with the final 2 bars shortened to 3 beats of descending motion and 3 beats of fourth motion to bring it to a resolution on the tonic C right in time with the melody. Follow along again and see if you can follow this structure. This misalignment of the phrasing of the bass and the melody has such a cool effect. This theme keeps the cheerful hometown aesthetic the game needed without feeling saccharine or overly simple. It's just such a fun piece of music to listen to. Alina's theme, the Tomboy Princess's March, is one of my favorite tracks from the game. It takes the idea of the chromatic bassline one step further by removing the bassline and leaving behind only chromatically descending inner voices. Without the bass, the harmony is only implied, but thanks to Sugiyama's mastery of voice leading, he's able to manage this without any bass notes to ground the progression. Before we get there, let's start at the top. The piece opens by sitting on a G minor chord underneath this bouncy melody that heavily emphasizes the raised sixth of the key, E natural. I love the playful cynicism of this section. Between this A section and the following B section, we get 2 bars of held G minor chord where the bass drops out, leaving behind only the 3rd and 5th of the chord, B flat and D. Coming from a section where we were getting G minor chords beaten into our heads on every beat, it feels clear that these 2 transition bars are playing a G minor chord, even though there's no bass note, which makes it a vital transition leading into the next section. Even without the G present, we can feel the implied G bass, thanks to the music that came before, and when the melody to the B section starts, we still feel that implied G bass note. As the chords shift bar by bar, we still feel the implication that there is a bass note somewhere, but it becomes unclear exactly what that bass note should be. This shrouds the music in a thick fog of harmonic ambiguity, leaving the listener feeling like we've gone astray somewhere. The implied G minor chord from the transition continues into the first bar with a heartbreaking held second in the melody that resolves down to the root. The second bar sees the D natural in the harmony slide down to a D flat, and then this pair of notes continues to slide down in half steps every 2 beats until the very end of the phrase. You wouldn't think that you'd be able to build a functional chord progression just by moving down chromatically for such a long time, but that's exactly what this piece unbelievably does. The B flat and D flat in the second bar slide down to an A and C, and these note movements are the exact voice leading inherent to the minor 4/1 cadence in the key of F, B flat minor to F major. Just like how Sugiyama evoked the secondary dominant just by using the voice leading of the 7/1 and the 4/3 way back in our first example, here he evokes the sound of the minor 4/1 without including the tonic note of the 1 chord in the cadence at all. If we go down the voice leading rabbit hole like this on each of these movements, we can see this as an implied F chord moving to an A-flat diminished chord, which brings us back to our G minor, a colorful but not uncommon way to get from the 1 chord to the 2 chord. These G and B-flat notes move down to F sharp and A, which combined with the melody notes above it seem to add up to an A minor 6 chord, which then slides down to another minor 4/1 cadence. This time, it's an implied F minor 6 resolving to a C major. The pattern continues with the C jumping up to an E-flat diminished 7 chord that resolves down to D minor, another way of linking the 1 and 2 chords in our new apparent key of C major. And then this last move breaks the chromatic chain by having only one of the voices move down by a half step, finally giving us some solid footing as we resolve unambiguously to an A major chord. Let's hear this again and see if you can follow the implied resolutions. With the bass lines in our earlier examples, the chromatic motion gets justified using the other notes around it to build a functional chord progression, but managing to leave the justifying notes out and still imply harmony that makes sense is pure music wizardry. Wandering through these different keys feels effortless and graceful thanks to the perfect arrangement of voice leading, and all it's doing is going down in half steps. There's so much more that could be said about this soundtrack, to the point that I'm sure I'll revisit it again someday. I learned a ton looking at these tracks, and I'm still stunned by the sophistication present in such an early game soundtrack. Koichi Sugiyama is truly a master of his craft. Thanks so much for watching. I'll see you all in the next one.